Andre and Tori had a simple but special tradition, chatting over FaceTime almost every night. It was their way of staying connected despite busy schedules. That night, during a suffocating heatwave, Tori was home alone while her parents were out of town. The conversation started as usual, filled with laughs and stories about their day, while the hum of a fan buzzed in the background. Andre enjoyed these light-hearted moments, but something about the atmosphere that night felt different. As the call went on, Tori casually mentioned being hungry and thinking about going to the kitchen. That's when she offhandedly remarked that the front door had been open when she got home. She laughed, joking that maybe it was the wind or a simple oversight. But for Andre, the comment stuck out. His gut reaction was immediate: why was the door open, especially when she was alone? The terror, still veiled, was beginning to creep into the conversation. Andre tried to disguise his concern, keeping the conversation light. Still, his mind was already racing, piecing together possibilities. After all, in real-life horror stories, it's often the seemingly small details that become the catalyst for something bigger. He continued talking, but the growing weight of unease was impossible to ignore. It was as if the night was shifting, preparing for something unexpected. As they continued talking, Tori headed to the kitchen to grab a snack. Andre stayed on the call, his thoughts still circling around the open door she'd mentioned. He tried to laugh along with her, but he couldn't shake the question: why was the door open, especially in an empty house? The heat of the night no longer felt like the source of his discomfort, it was something deeper, something more unsettling. When Tori returned to the camera, she seemed completely at ease, but Andre couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong. He asked a few casual questions, trying not to sound alarmed. Are you sure your parents didn't leave it open? Or, did you lock it after you came in? Her light-hearted answers only deepened his worry. Real-life horror stories often start with these small, overlooked moments, dismissed until it's too late. The mood of the call began to shift, at least for Andre. While Tori laughed and chatted about her snack, Andre found himself scrutinizing the background of the screen, as if expecting to see something out of place. Every shadow seemed darker, every movement of the fan slower. The fear began seeping in, silently, like an invisible presence in their conversation. Everything changed when Tori left her phone in the bedroom to go back to the kitchen. Andre stayed on the call, idly watching the screen, when something happened that made his heart race. For a brief moment, a man appeared in the background, walking past the door and looking directly into the camera. His gaze was sharp and deliberate, as though he knew Andre was watching. Before Andre could react, the man disappeared, leaving an eerie emptiness on the screen. Andre's mind raced as he tried to process what he had just seen. He wanted to yell, to call Tori back, but something held him back. What if the man was still there? What if alerting her put her in immediate danger? The panic was suffocating, but he knew he had to stay calm. At that moment, psychological terror took hold. Andre was certain of what he'd seen, but Tori was still in the dark, blissfully unaware of the threat. As Andre waited for Tori to return, he began devising a plan. He needed to act, to ensure her safety without alarming the intruder. Every second felt like an eternity, the silence in Tori's house only amplifying the weight of the situation. When she finally came back, Andre knew his mission was clear: stay calm, pretend everything was normal, and get her out of that house as safely as possible. Andre knew he had to think fast. He kept his voice steady, even as his heart pounded, and started talking to Tori as if nothing was wrong. He asked casual questions about her snack and mentioned he had something funny to show her, all while secretly dialing the police on his phone. The challenge was acting natural because any change in tone could alert the intruder. The fear of putting Tori in immediate danger was overwhelming, but Andre couldn't afford to make a mistake. While waiting for the police to answer, Andre used trivial questions to keep Tori on the camera, trying to assess whether the man was still there. When the dispatcher finally picked up, Andre quickly explained the situation, speaking in a way that wouldn't arouse suspicion. Each second felt like an eternity, but the officers assured him they were on their way. Andre knew that wasn't enough. He needed to get Tori out of the house before anything worse happened. With his mind racing, Andre came up with an excuse to convince Tori to go outside. He told her there was something interesting in the yard she should check out, maintaining a casual tone to avoid raising alarm. When she finally stepped outside, he seized the moment to warn her through FaceTime, "Run to the neighbor's house now." The initial confusion in Tori's eyes quickly turned to panic, but she followed his instructions, while Andre stayed on the call, listening to every step as if his own life depended on it. The next few minutes were a mix of relief and tension. Tori reached the neighbor's house, where an elderly woman quickly locked the doors behind her. Meanwhile, the police arrived at Tori's home, entering with weapons drawn. Andre stayed on the FaceTime call, his nerves on edge as he listened to the unfolding events. Every second, he hoped to hear that the intruder had been caught, but the silence that followed was more unnerving than any noise. After searching the house, the officers concluded that the man had fled. The back doors were unlocked, and footprints indicated he had escaped through the yard. For Tori, the realization that the intruder had been so close, and could return at any moment, was paralyzing. Despite the relief of being safe, the absence of a clear resolution left an unsettling atmosphere. The home that once felt like a sanctuary now seemed like a trap. In the weeks that followed, Tori tried to move on, but the experience left deep scars. Andre, too, couldn't forget the man's direct stare into the camera, as if mocking him. For both of them, this real-life horror story served as a chilling reminder that fear doesn't always come with answers or satisfying conclusions. Sometimes, it lingers in the mind, turning into a shadow that refuses to fade. Casey, as usual, went out for a night of fun with her friends. The evening began with laughter and stories, but it took a dark turn when Casey was last seen leaving the bar with a man no one recognized. At first, her friends weren't too worried, thinking it was just another casual encounter. However, hours passed, and Casey stopped responding to messages and calls. Unease grew, transforming what should have been an ordinary night into a real-life horror story. When they finally received a call from Casey's number, hope quickly turned to fear. On the other end of the line, there was only static and muffled murmurs, as if someone was trying to hide something. Her friends tried to trace her whereabouts, but the responses were vague and disjointed. It felt as if Casey was both present and unreachable. With every passing minute, the psychological terror mounted, leaving everyone involved with a sense of urgency and helplessness. The night seemed endless. Attempts to reach her only resulted in disconnected calls, where Casey's voice seemed to whisper something before vanishing into the static. Her friends began to imagine the worst-case scenarios, the kind of terrifying events typical of true horror stories. As doubt turned to panic, they decided it was time to involve Casey's family and the authorities, knowing that time was of the essence to uncover what was truly happening. When Casey's phone was finally answered, what should have been a moment of relief quickly turned into something chilling. On the screen was not Casey but a man sitting in a dimly lit room. His face was partially obscured by shadows, and his voice was low, almost a whisper. He refused to show Casey and offered confusing explanations about her whereabouts. With every word he spoke, unease grew, and the mystery deepened. The friend on the call froze for a moment, trying to process what was happening. The man casually claimed that Casey was fine but couldn't talk right now. The image of the dark room, coupled with his evasive demeanor, felt like something straight out of a horror story. It was as if he was trying to intimidate, playing on the growing fear of the person on the other end. Even without concrete evidence, the psychological terror had already taken hold. Unsure of what to do, the friend decided to buy time. She kept the conversation going, trying to extract information while suppressing the panic rising inside her. Every detail in the background of the video seemed to hide something more sinister, a partially open door, distant footsteps, or the oppressive silence between the man's words. The call, which should have provided answers, only raised more questions and confirmed one thing: something was terribly wrong. During the call, the man finally provided an address, suggesting the friend come there to pick up Casey. The way he spoke felt calculated, almost provocative, as if he knew they would hesitate. The friend wrote down the address but sensed something was off in his tone and knew she couldn't go alone. Feeling the situation was too dangerous for impulsive action, she involved Casey's mother and the police immediately. When the authorities were informed, they treated the case with the seriousness it deserved. However, doubts lingered: was the address legitimate or a trap? The fear of the unknown was overwhelming, and every step felt risky. Casey's mother, anxious and worried, insisted they wait for the police before taking any action. The psychological terror was in every detail, from the man's tone of voice to the growing sense of urgency. As they waited for the police to prepare an approach to the location, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The friend and Casey's mother tried to stay calm, but it was impossible to ignore the pressing questions. Who was this man? Why was he answering Casey's phone? What was happening inside that address? Every moment of waiting was a reminder that they were dealing with something beyond their control, a true horror story unfolding before their eyes. When the police finally arrived at the provided address, the outcome was unexpected. Before they could even investigate the location, Casey contacted her mother, explaining that she was home and safe. The twist brought relief but also confusion and fear. Casey recounted how she had entered a car she believed to be an Uber, only to realize too late that something was wrong. The driver and the man from the bar were accomplices in a terrifying setup. Casey managed to escape when the car stopped in a deserted area, taking advantage of a moment when the captors were distracted. She ran without looking back, eventually finding help at a gas station before returning home. Her mother, relieved, could hardly believe what she was hearing. The story Casey told was one of the most harrowing true horror stories imaginable. That she had escaped unharmed felt like nothing short of a miracle. Although Casey was safe, the tension lingered. The involvement of accomplices, the man on the FaceTime call, and the address provided revealed that the plan was far more elaborate than it initially seemed. Even at home, the impact of the ordeal left its mark. Casey knew the experience would remain etched in her memory as a reminder of just how fragile the sense of safety can be. Despite the relief of knowing Casey was safe at home, the unanswered questions made the case even more unsettling. The police went to the address provided by the mysterious man and found the location empty, with no signs of recent activity. It was as if the perpetrators had vanished without a trace. Casey's phone, tracked to that location, only deepened the mystery. The realization that the plan was far more intricate than anyone had imagined began to sink in. The identity of the man who appeared on FaceTime remained a mystery, as did his intentions. Was this an isolated incident or part of something larger? The level of coordination among the perpetrators raised chilling questions about how often schemes like this occur. Casey and her family couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened if she hadn't managed to escape. The psychological terror of reliving those moments in her mind was inescapable. As days passed, the case lost momentum in the investigation, but it never stopped haunting those involved. For Casey, the experience was not just a horror story, it was a constant reminder of the dangers that can arise in the most unexpected moments. The gaps and mysteries surrounding the captors turned the event into a true horror story, one that stays alive in memory for years, a dark reminder of how vulnerable we can be. Mark didn't expect his night to be any different from usual. After dropping his brother off at a friend's house, he returned home, made himself something to eat, and settled into his room as the snowstorm raged outside. He felt comfortable, playing games on his computer and chatting with his friend Jay on FaceTime. The sound of snowflakes hitting the window created an atmosphere that, despite the cold, felt oddly comforting. But, as many real horror stories show, fear can creep in when you least expect it. As he talked with Jay, Mark felt relaxed, ignoring the absolute silence of the house. He was alone and, in his mind, completely safe. The storm outside made the house feel even more isolated, like he was in a world of his own. Jay, on the other end of the call, joked about the game, unaware that his attention would soon be drawn to something far more frightening. The psychological terror hadn't revealed itself yet, but the first signs were starting to surface. Little by little, Mark began to sense that something felt off. The conversation was flowing well, but the silence around him felt too heavy. It was as if the storm outside was masking something inside the house. His friend was still animated about the game, but Mark couldn't shake an uneasy feeling, the kind of intuition that tells you something is wrong, even when everything seems normal. While Mark continued gaming, Jay made a comment that shattered the casual mood. "Hey, what's that behind you?" Jay asked, his voice teetering between curiosity and concern. Confused, Mark turned to look but saw nothing. Jay insisted, he had seen something, or someone, peeking from behind the room divider. The silence grew heavier, and fear began to take shape. Real-life horror stories always start like this, with small details that unravel into something much bigger. Mark tried to brush off the comment, saying it was probably just a shadow or a reflection. But Jay was convinced about what he'd seen. He described the figure as someone slightly tilting their head, as if observing Mark while trying to remain hidden. The thought was disturbing, and Mark felt a chill run down his spine. Now, every sound seemed louder, every shadow more threatening. The psychological terror was starting to settle in, subtly but undeniably. Determined not to let fear take over, Mark got up to check his room. He tried to stay calm, but each step felt like it echoed louder than it should. His friend, still on FaceTime, watched intently, as though part of a real-life suspense game. Mark scanned the room, checking every corner, but found nothing. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, and that was perhaps the most terrifying part of all. As Mark tried to calm himself after Jay's unsettling observation, he noticed something even stranger. His cat, usually sociable and playful, was hiding under the bed, eyes wide and ears alert. The animal wasn't moving, as if something unseen was terrifying it. This unusual behavior only reinforced Mark's growing suspicion that something was deeply wrong. Real horror stories often include these moments, animals sensing danger before humans do. Mark called out to his cat, but it refused to come out from under the bed, letting out a low, fearful meow. He crouched down to try and coax it out, but the cat shrank back even further, as if it was afraid of something behind Mark. His heart began to race. Every detail seemed to fit into a macabre puzzle: Jay's warning, the feeling of being watched, and now the cat's alarming behavior. The psychological terror was no longer just a possibility, it was almost tangible. Determined to investigate, Mark began walking through the house, paying close attention to every sound and shadow. The cat remained hidden, and that only deepened his paranoia. As he checked each room, Jay stayed on the call, trying to reassure him but growing more anxious himself. Mark knew he had to keep a level head, but the fear was growing with each passing second, like an invisible, suffocating presence. As Mark explored the house, he began hearing subtle noises, a faint creak in the floorboards, a muffled sound that could have been breathing. At first, he tried to convince himself these were just the normal sounds of an old house on a cold night, but something didn't feel right. When he entered the living room, he froze, holding his breath. Behind the sofa, he could make out slight movement, as if someone was hiding there. The fear that had seemed psychological now manifested as something terrifyingly real. Mark knew he had to stay calm. He quietly returned to his room, grabbed his phone, and locked the door. On the FaceTime call with Jay, he explained in hushed tones what he had seen. Jay, equally frightened, urged Mark to call the police immediately. With trembling hands, Mark dialed emergency services, describing the situation as calmly as he could. As he waited for the police to arrive, every second felt like an eternity. He tried not to make a sound, but his heartbeat was so loud it felt like even the intruder could hear it. The sound of sirens in the distance brought a mix of relief and apprehension. Mark didn't know what to expect, but the arrival of the police seemed like the only way out of this nightmare. As the officers approached, he couldn't stop imagining what might have happened if he hadn't noticed the signs. The presence of the intruder was a stark reminder that real-life horror stories aren't just tales, they can invade anyone's life in a moment of vulnerability. The police arrived quickly and surrounded the house, moving with precision and caution. Mark, still locked in his room, could hear the firm commands and heavy footsteps echoing through the hallway. The moment of greatest tension came when the officers announced they had found the intruder. He was crouched behind the sofa, holding a knife, as if waiting for the right moment to act. The air in the living room felt heavy, and Mark's relief was mixed with the terror of what could have happened. The intruder was disarmed and taken into custody, but the psychological impact of the event didn't fade easily. The officers explained that the man seemed to have been watching Mark for some time before entering the house, likely waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. The most chilling detail: he had chosen the snowy night specifically because he believed the storm would muffle any suspicious sounds or movements. It was a meticulously calculated plan, underscoring just how frighteningly real terror can be. For Mark, this experience left permanent scars. He knew that the quick intervention of Jay, the cat, and the police had saved his life, but it didn't erase the memory of the moment he realized he wasn't alone. That night became a true horror story, one that would linger in his memory as a constant reminder of how danger can be much closer than we ever imagine.